The landscape around Arcadia is a ruin, covered in standing water and mud, and pockmarked with scorched craters. Some no bigger than a footprint, some deep furrows and trenches that a man could fall into. The ground is scoured clean of most features: villages, trees, landmarks. About the only notable features now are many fragments of wrecked ships, and grisly remains of various crews. When Steelshod limps into Arcadia, wet and bedraggled and crippled, they find the city in worse shape than they are. They enter from the south, the land side, and the furthest point from King's Bay. The gate is unguarded, and the streets are layered in several inches of brackish, filthy water. The deeper they go into Arcadia, the worse the damage. Overall, the city can be divided into 3 bands. The docks and inland from the docks for almost half the city have been leveled. The piers, the warehouses, the dockside taverns, brothels, hovels. Nothing remains but piles of rubble, splintered wood, corpses, and standing water. The wrecks of buildings, ships, and men. Even the seawall is gone, and the places the walls of Arcadia meet the sea have been viciously battered and torn apart. The next section of Arcadia is severely damaged, but intact. Half-collapsed buildings, or buildings with pieces of Spartic longships, crashed through their roof, and a great deal of standing water, several feet deep in some areas. The final band, closest to the south walls and the main gate, is the most intact. The damage is significant but manageable, and it is here that the King of Arcadia's inner keep and palace lay, relatively protected by the secondary wall. The good news is the city is far from dead. Thousands of people still live, but most of them have lost loved ones, homes, wealth, everything. As a large force of heavily armed warriors, Steelshod draws a lot of attention. It's not long before some tattered remains of Arcadian military confront them. What's left of the Arcadian Guard, led by one Sir Simon Hartley, clearly a young knight who's inherited his position after the events of the last several days. They learn that Lord Winston Marshall was not in Arcadia during the firefall. He has been in the field, chasing Ter Bjornsson across eastern Arcadia. Word is that he's got about half the Arcadian army with him, and he regrouped with the survivors of Kilchester. Nice to know there were survivors. The other half of the army, along with most of the naval power, was left to defend Arcadia, commanded by Sir Hartley's predecessor, a High Lord and commander of the capital's defenses. This High Lord, along with nearly all of the military might the Marshal left behind, boarded the cogs to meet the Svards in battle in King's Bay. All presumed dead. So, the firefall has accounted for at least half of Arcadia's fighting force in a single hour. Not to mention, wiped clean the northern coastline, the Arcadian peninsula, and all of the farmlands and towns in those areas. Alexander explains to Hartley that they were hired by the Marshal to serve Arcadia, and, as far as he's concerned, until the Marshal returns, they are at the disposal of the Arcadian Guard. Good news, as Hartley currently has 17 able-bodied men with which to patrol and protect the kingdom's capital, the palace, and the personage of King Edric Arcadia IV. Crime is rampant in the city, Arcadians fighting one another for food, beer, and fresh water, and some broken men have begun prowling the edges of the city. Svard Arcadian makes no difference, as men broken by the horrors of the war will often turn to banditry out of desperation. Agrippa immediately sets about setting up a medical station in a centralized location, with Nate and Ignis directing efforts to clear a patch of ground in the most devastated area for Agrippa to work in. Those in Steelshod not too crippled to work begin joining in patrols. Given the state of things, too crippled to work does not include such trivial wounds as broken arms or ribs, minor concussions, or any lacerations that seem to be stitched enough to allow partial mobility. Alexander and Yoren are granted an audience with King Edric. A young man, taught rulership by Lord Marshal, he is generally considered to be a good king, clearly overwhelmed by the events of the past few days. They recount what happened at Kilchester, and present Hakon to be placed, carefully, into the Arcadian dungeons. Yoren gives clear instructions to keep him gagged at all times, and warns about his ability to cloud minds. Yoren has a tendency to interrupt the king during their audience, which does not exactly endear him to either Edric or what remains of his court and council. But given the difficult times, he is not punished for the impertinence. Given that Steelshod has clearly served faithfully, and so far only for the promise of payment, Edric has some funds drawn out from the treasury. A pittance of what they are owed, given the high rate they got Marshal to agree to, and the length of their campaign so far, but he has a ruined capital to worry about. And gold is gold. Alexander thanks him for his generosity. For the record, we decided on a base 50 currency system, and the silver standard. So, 50 copper to a silver, 50 silver to a gold. And insofar as a 30 player's handbook has any bearing on Torath's world at this point, gold prices of sundry items equate to our silver prices. So, most items can be bought in silver. A warhorse or a suit of armor might cost a few gold pieces. Like classic D&D players, we just refer to the coins by their metal, whether the coins themselves are Castleine sesterces or Torathian shekels. We don't pay much attention. Alexander and Yoren had been funding everything themselves, from payments received by Giancarlo and back in Yerevan, mostly relying on spoils of war to get by day to day. Now Jaspar calculates the payment they are due, and it's actually pretty staggering. Even new members with a single share are due to receive a sizable purse of gold. The payment they receive is just a small fraction of this, but it's better than nothing. They give Alejandra the payment that would have gone to Carlito and Martin. Hubert and Leona have been trying to make a connection with her, but haven't had much luck. She has grown withdrawn and quiet. She tells Alexander and Yoren that she would like to leave the company, take the coin meant for her lads back to their homes, to Martin's farm, and Carlito's aunt. She says she might return after, but she has some thinking to do. Alexander and Yoren are sad to see her go, but they understand. They cut into their own funds in payment, and several other members of Steelshod that volunteer. They pay her out the full amount that both she and her 2 men are owed, a princely sum, enough to retire on. Agrippa gives her instructions on when to change the splint on her arm, and Alejandra departs, alone, riding the long road south to Spitalia. Despite this new loss and the utter devastation on the streets of Arcadia, life goes on. Felix completes work on a pair of Vartror-style reflex bows, one for Yoren, one for Kara. They have a phenomenally hard pull, and they crack like a whip every time they loose an arrow. But they hit harder than a traditional bow of similar size. Still, Felix scoffs, preferring the good old Cadian longbow. The Ulfsknar show Yoren and Kara the proper draw style for their new bows, and Alexander crafts them both metal thumb rings to aid in their shooting. Speaking of the Ulfsknar, they draw a lot of attention on the streets of Arcadia, little of it good. There had always been the occasional issue with Gunnar and his accents, but the Ulfsknar can be identified on sight alone. After a tense moment with some angry commoners that lost kin to Bearsark raids, other, friendly Middish members of Steelshod begin accompanying the wolves wherever they go about the city. Felix and Kara begin spending a fair amount of time together. Kara seems to like rude, arrogant, self-assured pricks, and Yoren has continued to spurn every one of her advances. Felix, on the other hand, is fascinated by the red-headed beauty. Alexander seeks out one of Arcadia's local smiths, a man that helped Alexander learn the craft some months ago, personally helps him rebuild his smithy and relight his forge. In exchange, the man helps Alexander as he begins repairing and replacing the arms and armor his company lost during the firefall, or in the campaign before it. He also begins expanding his armor, using Leon's heavy lorgnette plate as a model, adding more plate pieces, covering more gaps. When he's done, he's taken the plate and mail that many of Steelshod uses and turned it into something closer to full plate. Hubert spends his time in research. He studies the Ulfsknar howls with Hrodir and Drengi. He's got the basics down, but can't easily decipher an actual howl. At night, in secret, he studies the ritual tools taken from Hakon's ship. He begins practicing some of the most basic forms of blood magic. Of course, using only himself for blood, and not using a lot of it. He can't really accomplish much. But he's learning the principle behind it, how it seems to function, and that faith in Vlar does not actually appear to be a prerequisite for getting results. Hubert also gathers alchemical supplies. Alchemy is an odd thing, a niche skill, jealously guarded by most practitioners. Few understand it fully, even the alchemists. Half the time, ingredients are cheap and plentiful because nobody else even recognizes their worth. Hubert might pay urchins to gather rusty nails from the wreckage, dissolve them in an acid, and extract some particulates. The other half the time, they are expensive. Uncommon metals, acids, plants, and similar. At the table, we keep the gathering of resources abstracted. Alchemy is, by design, 1 part chemistry and 2 parts sorcery. Hubert makes some rolls, pays some coin, and gets ingredients. The cost of a single unit of alchemical ingredient can run the gamut of a few silver pieces to over a gold piece, with an average in the 20 to 30 silver range. Since the alchemical potions take 4 ingredients in quantities ranging from 1 to 4 each, that means your typical potion costs approximately 3 to 5 gold pieces, which might explain why we aren't throwing dragon fires and eye burn at every bearsark we meet. Hubert did fairly recently develop a new potion, though, called Essence of Grace. It's a powerful restorative that promotes healing, reducing time to recovery of injuries and increasing overnight healing of HP. Very useful right now, with more than most of the company suffering from 1 or more injuries. Amidst all this alchemy, Hubert finally has the time to really take Yoren up on his offer of training. Until now, he's been supplying Yoren with pots, and occasionally showing him bits and pieces of the process. But now, Yoren begins learning all stages of the alchemical process. Yoren also spends a lot of time practicing with Olivenko, learning the ins and outs of something Olivenko has talked about since they first practiced fighting together. Olivenko says the swordmasters of Spitalia call it the bind. The bind occurs when 2 warriors are facing off against each other. This is not the lock blades dramatically and push on each other method as seen in cheap movies and TV shows. The bind is much more subtle than that. Their blades may be touching, but if so, only lightly. They may simply be in a guard stance, ready to strike. Mastering the bind is more to do with observation, the reflexes behind it, sensing your opponent's move before they have even begun it. It's in the eyes, in the footwork, in the grip, and in the form. One that has mastered the bind can control the flow of a duel, turning reaction into preemptive action, and ending a fight before it begins. Yoren's Tier 9 ability is called Bind and Break. He may use 1 or both of his attacks, 1 for each of his weapons, to target 1 or both of an opponent's hands. If the opponent uses the targeted hands, Yoren can take a reactive roll against them with advantage. Sufficiently skilled swordsmen can negate this via their own skills and abilities, using feints, etc. But overall, it's an excellent way to lock down a single foe. While we're on the subject of Yoren's tiers, he has 1 odd tier that he picked up at Tier 8 that is also worth mentioning. It requires a bit of backstory, though, and it's a sort of meta tier. The guy that plays Yoren has, let's just call it odd luck. He rolls a lot of crits, and he rolls a lot of garbage. I mean a lot of garbage. And remember, Yoren's damage is pretty much entirely from dice. On a face stab with Olivenko's sword, at this point in the story he's dishing something like 4d8 plus 1 damage, which is great. Unless you roll 3 1s and a 2. Which he honestly does with unrealistic frequency. At some point, after rolling Snake Eyes for the umpteenth time, one of us cracked a joke. Yoren's a Tarathi. Shouldn't Snake Eyes be lucky for him? And at Tier 8, we took this literally. Enter Faithful of Torath. When he rolls 2 1s in a set of dice, he can maximize both dice. If he was rolling a single die, he can roll the same die again. If it comes up 1, maximize the original roll. This helped to massively smooth out his damage rolls and gave him a 1 in 20 chance of turning every natural 1 into a natural 20, which happened a lot more than you might think. See above, the man rolls a lot of garbage. Meanwhile, when he's not working the forge, Alexander spends time with his men, and with Elena. Elena has continued to improve, at least on the surface, but she confides in Alexander that his suspicion was correct. She has no desire to return to the faith. He sees that she is feeling lost, abandoned by her god, and, well, hopeless, in a sense. But he doesn't know how to help her. He gives her what love and comfort he can, and hopes it will be enough. Gwyneth and the sons continue to stay attached to Steelshod. They've made many friends, and, frankly, Gwyneth trusts Alexander and Yoren to have better strategic awareness than her. For the time being, though, they are mostly recovering in Agrippa's infirmary, patrolling the streets, or relaxing with the other lads in off hours. After some time spent in Arcadia, a rider comes to the city. He announces that the marshal is returning from the field. What's left of his army is coming with him. The news is good. The marshal met Bjornsson and his army in battle, on battlefield conditions carefully chosen by Brutus Varley, and, though they suffered heavy losses, they emerged victorious. Bjornsson's army was scattered, and the High Jarl of the Svards was slain by the combined efforts of Lord Winston Marshall and a retinue of knights. The war is over. Thank you for tuning in to Steelshod, a series by Mostly Rights, narrated by Taleforge. You can find every chapter in text format, as well as character sheets, setting information, maps, and rule documents on the Steelshod tabletop system in the link below. If you'd like to support the channel, you can pop down to the description and use the Patreon link for recurring donations, the PayPal.me link for one-time donations, the Teespring link for shirts with the incredibly cool background art by Nobody, or use the DriveThruRPG affiliate link the next time you're looking to try a new system. If you'd like to support the author, you can find Steelshod merch on the MostlyRights.com store, or donate to the Mostly Rights Patreon, which are both linked on reddit.com/r/mostlyrights down below.